Hi, everybody. It's so good to see you. I'm so glad that you're with us. For those of you who don't know me, I am Julian Marivel. I'm a professor of communication at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, where I've been now, I cannot believe to say this, but 20 years. And I'm also the co founder of the Positive Communication Network with many of our friends here. I want to tell you a little bit about the network and who we are and what we're going to really do today in particular. So let me do that very quickly. Okay, here it is. So you may be wondering, what is the Positive Communication Network? So around 2022, a group of scholars, including myself, got together with the idea of forming a community that could help promote the study and practice of positive communication. Our mission is simple: to foster a community dedicated to creating better social worlds for all through positive communication research, positive communication education, and of course, positive communication practice. You can see here on the slide, we've got a vision for what we're trying to accomplish, but really we want to serve as a group designed to create some momentum, both in terms of the scholarship. But I will tell you, we're really interested in informing practice. We want our scholarship and our research to inform the way people communicate in everyday life, at home and at work. The group was formed with people from all around the US here. You can see some of them are here today, but it took 7 of us to come and bring this Positive Communication Network to life. Today, I've got Dr. Ryan Fuller, who is from Sacramento State University. You'll get to see him a little bit later on. Dr. Philip Glenn, who is a professor of communication at Emerson College, and he's going to be leading our fireside chat. Dr. Tom Soha, who is a professor of communication at Old Dominion University, and of course, one of the kind of energizing force behind this, the study of positive communication in general. So we're so glad that Tom is part of this group. Anyway, our goal for today, and what we really started to do about a year and a half ago, was to identify books that, for our perspective, would be celebrating the co-construction of better social worlds, readings that really make a difference for both scholars, but also practitioners. And today we're really thrilled to be featuring a brand new book by Dr. Valerie Manusov from the University of Washington and Dr. Devon Geary from the Institute for Common Power. The book is titled Facilitating Interracial Dialogues About Race. And so we have 1 hour together to celebrate that book, to hear from them, and of course, to engage as much as possible together. Let me tell you a little bit about the book. The authors wrote this to me when they described it. They said, in our political and social silos, we form beliefs about other people that are often and misinformed. And the best way to interrupt our misperceptions is obviously to connect with one another. Talking to people we perceive as different in terms of their beliefs and lived experiences, and learning to truly listen to and hear those stories is obviously crucial to nurture the mutual empathy and understanding that is necessary to transform our society and world for the better. And so their book, Facilitating Interracial Dialogues About Race, offers ways to more effectively connect across human difference, and in the process, we believe, realize our shared humanity. So I'm thrilled to have Dr. Valerie Manusov and Dr. Devon Geary here. The way this event will go is we're going to start with a 20-minute presentation from the author so they can tell us the story of the book and really what they were after. And honestly, I'm just going to be just as you interested in what they're going to share. After that little moment, we're going to have Phil, who is going to be leading the fireside chat. So we've prepared some questions to dig a little bit more deeply with the authors about their experiences and what they're doing. And then in the third part, we're going to open it up for question and answer. So please, if you've got questions, put it in the Q&A. We have opened the Q&A format in Zoom. All you need to do is put your question in the Q&A, and then we'll be returning to this at the end of the session today. And then at 1 o'clock, if you want to stay with us, Ryan Fuller will be taking us to the after party. It's pretty wild, I want to warn you, but I hope that you can join us. Okay, without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about the authors, and then we'll get going. So Dr. Valerie Manusov, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington, where she teaches courses in research methods and interpersonal, nonverbal, and intercultural and intergroup communication. and she also leads the Departmental Honors Program. In 2022, she received the Mark Knapp Award in Interpersonal Communication from the National Communication Association. I had the pleasure of interviewing Valerie years ago for one of my books, and I still remember that interview today. Actually, in many of my talks, I share some of what we talked about. Next, we have Dr. Devon Geary. She's a senior program manager for the Institute for Common Power. We'll put the links in a little bit so you can get to learn more about that organization. Throughout her career, she has been part of initiatives focused on racial equity and democracy, including at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Mississippi, Highlander Research and Education Center in Tennessee, and Project Pilgrimage in Washington. We're so thrilled that both of you are with us and that you wrote a book to help us engage with one another across difference. And I can't wait to see what you're going to share with us. So the floor is yours. Let's give them a big, hearty, warm welcome through chat or by doing these little magic fingers that sometimes we can do. So welcome to the group.
Thank you all so much for having us. And thank you, Jillian, in particular, for inviting us to do this. We're both very excited to be here. As the description that Jillian just provided says, we did this for a particular reason. So even before this moment that we're in, when politicians and media sources are trying to separate groups from each other and denigrate attempts at cultivating and celebrating greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are organizations across the US that are working vigorously to counter an us-them view of the world. They are instead engaging in activities to foster a better and more just world for us all. In this time of grief, they offer us sources of light and hope. Consistent with historical efforts to do the same, some of which we talk about in the introduction to our book, and often led by the people that are most marginalized, these organizations help community members engage in conversations across difference. The goals of these organizations vary, but in all cases, they're working to create bridging ties across social groups who might otherwise remain separate, even if living in the same towns or regions. Bridging ties, which is actually a noun rather than a verb, although you do the verb to get to the noun, are social connections between people who come from different social spaces and who engage across demographic differences and social stratification. Ties that bridge members of groups support the dissemination and exchange of knowledge, wisdom, resources, opportunities, and access, and are particularly critical for communities that are separated by inequity and injustice. Engaging and bridging ties can be seen as an act of resistance. When others are laboring to move us apart, these organizations and the participants within them endeavor to move toward each other, even when some dialogue participants want to be anywhere else but in these conversations. To do this important work, the myriad organizations around the country use facilitators to hold and move into and through these important dialogues. In this book, Facilitating Interracial Conversations About Race, based on Devon's dissertation work, we capture the facilitators and also people who refer to themselves as circle keepers for a specific reason. So we'll be referring to both of them. So facilitators and circle keepers' voices and experiences to learn what these dialogues entail. We did so by engaging groups of members of 15 organizations in the US doing these kinds of conversations to learn more about what doing so entails and why they engage in this important and inspiring work. In particular, we follow the premises of intergroup contact theory, which contends that there are certain conversational conditions that can maximize the ability for contact across difference to go well, and intergroup dialogue, which helps turn our attention to the communication practices that are thought to be most effective in bringing about positive change as people engage with others who are different from them. Our hope is that this book speaks not just to interracial conversations, but to any conversations across difference at the personal and organizational level. So we hope it's useful to many of you. As communication scholars, we center this work on the premise that intergroup dialogues are constituted in communication and as such are messy in the same way that all interactions are. So in addition to discerning and naming the conversational conditions and communication practices the facilitators tell us are part of these interracial dialogues across race, our goals were to understand what we call the dynamics, that is how the conditions and practices come into being and play out in these dialogues, as well as the challenges to doing so. We wanted to make these dialogues come alive for our readers and for practitioners so that not only do they get a list of what to do's, but also a sense of what is needed to do those things and what the lived opportunities and impediments of doing so involve. In our brief time with you, we will overview the 6 conversational conditions and 6 intra and interpersonal communication practices that we learned about from these facilitators. We also mentioned the dynamics and challenges of each very briefly. For each set of 6, we will reveal the overarching outcome of what the conditions and practices bring about, which for the conditions is constructing the container for change, and for the practices is enhancing our sense of shared humanity while also understanding the very different lived experiences that people have. Overall, we work to, as one of our facilitators says, to peddle hope, which is when we can look at what is possible more so in these challenging times and when it's needed perhaps more than ever in our lifetimes. So I'll turn it over now to Devon, who's going to talk a little bit more about our conversational conditions that we found.
Thank you, Dr. Manusov. Hi, folks. Lovely to be here. So I'm going to talk about the 6 conditions. When we interviewed the facilitators of interracial conversations about race, they talked about 6 conditions that they said really maximize the positive effects of intergroup contact in the community. And these conditions constituted, and Dr. Manusov said this, they said the container for dialogue, a container in which participants could engage in a different kind of communication than they were likely used to. So we looked at each of these conditions and the dynamics of enacting them. The first condition was that organizations, facilitators said that they really that it was very effective when they would use at least 2 interracial facilitators in each dialogue. And so these interracial facilitators modeled for the group the intergroup and interracial communication and collaboration that they wanted to see from their participants. The dynamics of enacting this condition included, for example, ongoing training and processing and reflecting on the part of the facilitators, both on their own and as a collective. It required another dynamic to enacting this condition was that it required cultivating a lot of mutual trust and respect and support between co-facilitators. And they talked about how being an interracial team enabled them to utilize their differences in positionality to navigate whatever came up in the community and to better support the diversity of participants. I can't list all the challenges for every one of these or all the dynamics, but one of the challenges that they talked about for this condition was that, as you can imagine, talking about these tough topics with groups as and as an interracial pair within our society, there was tension sometimes that emerged and conflict between co-facilitators. They didn't see that as a bad thing, but it was why they necessitated that dynamic of continuing to process and train together. The second condition, it was that they utilized communication agreements with the community members. Every organization we talked to did this. Communication agreements or guidelines or guideposts were huge. And these were commitments that participants made to one another about how they would conduct themselves in the dialogue. So for example, one of the organizations had a few like be present and welcoming, listen deeply to learn, no fixing. And so the dynamics of enacting this, facilitators would either co-create these shared agreements with their participants, or they would bring in their own set of agreements. And they would maybe moderate those with participants or not. Another way that they enacted this was that they re-emphasized these community agreements. Every time they got together, they'd have participants reread these values or community agreements. The third condition, I know I'm going fast, but we want to cover all of them. The third condition was that the facilitators always adapted to participants' readiness. They wanted the community to be the guide and to lead. And so the facilitators recognized that when participants knew that they had agency to decide the pace and the degree that they engaged, they would often lean in more to the dialogue. So some of the dynamics of enacting this condition, facilitators would assess the readiness of the community before they entered it. And they would also be sure that they were relinquishing control over the outcome. If they were going to be following the community, they couldn't have a tight hold grip on what the outcome of the dialogue would be, but they could sure as heck make sure that the process was equitable. The fourth condition was equalizing participant communication, and this is one that we can use in our everyday lives. They wanted to flatten the power dynamics within the community container. And the dynamics of this, how they enacted it, they'd sit participants in a circle so that they were equal. They'd give participants the same amount of time to speak or the same number of opportunities to speak. So they were really committed to giving each person the same space for their voice. And one facilitator said that this was spiritual. It was a spiritual experience because the person who may have been unhoused 6 months ago received the same amount of time as the mayor. They wanted to flatten the power dynamics in the group. Challenges would be for this condition that sometimes people interrupted each other or they overtalked and they took too much time. A fifth condition was that facilitators really worked to create a welcoming space. And that meant that dynamics of enacting this, no shaming or blaming in the space, encouraging participants to embrace their own and others' imperfections, to extend grace to each other, to discourage criticism or judgment. And facilitators also remained transparent and open about the process so that participants knew that there weren't going to be any surprises and that they were going to be along and co-creating the journey. The sixth condition, the last one, was that facilitators fostered critical consciousness amongst their participants. This was important for many organizations. And some dynamics, how they enacted this was that they would help participants understand structural oppression and systems of power, things we don't often learn in school. And they would talk to their participants about how to intervene in and challenge injustice. And a critical dynamic for this was that they would scaffold how they did it. So they didn't bring folks in and on the first day talk about structural oppression. They were going to build trust with the group and then begin to introduce knowledge that might not be as known to everybody who was participating. So one of the facilitators said, jumping in at the get-go with heavy topics, I would warn against that. I would advocate for allowing the group to guide the conversation in some ways, hearing the group and figuring out where they're going with the conversation so that they're leading. The challenges to that were that people would become defensive when they would learn about structural oppression and systemic inequity, especially the white participants. And that another challenge was that sometimes participants would stall between, they just wanted to build trust. They wanted to, learn together. They would stall between the dialogue and actually enacting and engaging in action. And that's where many of the organizations and facilitators wanted to get the participants. So I'll turn it back to you, Valerie, right as you're taking a sip.
Thank you, Devon. So the communication practices that occurred within this container of change and support were, again, 6 of them. So 6 communication practices that are both intra and interpersonal. The first, which probably would not surprise you, is self-disclosure. For people to learn about the lived experiences of others, they need to hear from those others. Doing so requires dialogue participants to talk about their lives. The facilitators and circle keepers want those disclosures to be open and vulnerable, something that can be hard for participants to do. And specifically, as Devon was saying, it often required scaffolding to get to that place. So the dynamics that they told us about were to help build muscle for vulnerable self-disclosure, are providing prompts, which they work on ahead of time and often scaffold from head to heart, getting people to move from what they're thinking to what they're feeling. Storytelling and perspective giving was particularly important. As one of our facilitators said, giving people the opportunity to share their personal stories uninterrupted without obvious judgment. I mean, we don't know what people are thinking in their heads, but at least in the space, there's no judgment. It's like, please share your story. The opportunity to be self-reflective, and of course, the opportunity to build that empathy muscle, because as people, we're all unique, but there's also these unique lived experiences within a racial group in this country. In addition to storytelling and perspective giving, and providing prompts, another dynamic was not allowing crosstalk and giving participants agency in their self-disclosures, letting them decide what to talk about. The challenges were a lack of willingness to engage, and so the participants often needed to be guided in their self-disclosures, often going back to those community agreements, community communication agreements that Devon discussed earlier. A second and related Communication practice was engaged listening, and perhaps the most important one. Perhaps more than any other practice, encouraging participants to listen deeply, openly, and empathically to others as they told their stories and shared experience is fundamental to these dialogues. That is, those who give their perspective need to feel heard that when they do so, for these conversations to be effective and empowering. The dynamics included suspending judgment and listening with curiosity and wonder. As one participant said, I have these marked, but not quite as clearly as I should. By creating a space between judgments and reactions, we can listen to the other and to ourselves more fully, and thus our perspectives, decisions, and actions are more informed. If you find yourself disagreeing with another, becoming judgmental, shutting down in defense, try turning to wonder. I wonder what brought her to this place. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what he's feeling now. You do not need to agree with another's story, but you do have to respect their right to tell their story. A third communication practice was expressing emotion. And I'll give you my second to last quote for this. This is about emotion, these dialogues. This is a visceral conversation. And so I expect people to be emotional and respond on some level emotionally. My goal is to give everyone space to speak their truth and then try to ensure that their truths were heard. So the tie between self-disclosure, listening, and emotion. The dynamics included the difficulty of moving people from their head to their heart, validating participants' emotions, and not interrupting or intervening. The challenges were emotional uncertainty, where people were not clear on what they were feeling, and also coping with emotions and keeping other participants from stepping in and trying to help people with that, letting them actually have their emotions. The fourth was introspection. It's used in many different words. Another is self-inquiry, which is a way for people to identify and grapple with their conscious and unconscious, deeply embedded feelings and beliefs. Very important for conversations about race. The dynamics included encouraging participant introspection and also attending to the facilitator's own need for self-reflection. The challenges were sitting in their own chair, not telling other people what to think, and also feeling fully baked, like I've done all this work already, I don't need to do any more. There was also a fifth practice, which was grounding, and this was important for both facilitators and participants, where they engaged in centering exercises, learned to slow down to get to the pace of the dialogue that was needed. But it was challenging because it was difficult to sometimes stay and maintain their grounding and keep their patience. They also finally, number 6 was modeling, where the facilitators particularly embodied these other 5 practices, in particular, engaging vulnerably and authentically. So overall, with this, telling our stories, being heard, being open to introspection and feelings, and getting help to do so through modeling and grounding provided an opportunity to learn that others' lives are not the same as our own, and at the same time, the struggles and triumphs are universal. That is, we're all part of the same family with innate needs for connection and community. And this is an antidote to the forces that work to distance and denigrate. Seeing ourselves as part of a larger whole allows dialogue participants to be part of a positive change that we need now more than anything. And this is a large part of why these facilitators and circle keepers do their work, how they peddle hope. Devon will finish by talking a little bit more about why they do this work and what they hope they can bring into the world, as well as some positive communication focused individuals such as yourselves can apply some of these ideas in other venues and contexts.
Thank you, Valerie. So as Valerie said, it's so important, especially in our current political context, which encourages interpersonal separation and othering, that we are trying to come together, that we're trying to bridge across our differences of identity and ideology. And so we learned a lot from these facilitators, and that was their chief kind of overarching goal, was to bring us together as one community, but one community that also recognized the pluralism, the richness of our differences of experiences. So I'm going to share like 3 kind of key takeaways, things that I know we utilize after writing this book in our everyday lives. So the first is that to have effective and tough conversations, it's critical to start by building trust. Facilitators talked about how necessary it was to build familiarity and connection before diving into deeper topics and issues. By building trust, you better ensure that people are more open and receptive to actually listening, and even while listening, seeing themselves, others, and their world, their shared world differently. When our limbic systems aren't in fight, flight, or freeze, they often are when we are maybe debating or trying to prove our points, we can relax and actually let folks' words sink in. We're more likely to listen and reflect. We generate interpersonal trust in part by being welcoming, one of the key conditions, by being curious instead of being judgmental, by seeking more to understand rather than solely trying to convince someone else of our point of view. And that can be immensely difficult and even seem counterintuitive at times, especially when we're talking about issues like this. When we're talking about race and politics, these are things that we are immensely passionate about for good reason, and we hold very, very strong opinions about. But the facilitators we interviewed told us that this is how you change minds. You build trust first, and then incrementally, as that trust builds, you can take the conversation deeper and deeper and start to challenge how people, their worlds, how they view the world around them. So the second point along that route, listening and storytelling are our superpowers. When we share stories and when we listen deeply to each other's stories, when we really listen, it deepens our sense of closeness. It illuminates our shared humanity, as Dr. Manusov said, and critically, it illuminates the differences in our lived experiences. Stories have this unique way of circumventing some of our defenses because they impact us in our hearts and in our heads. We feel stories, we empathize, we resonate, we recognize the commonalities of our stories, that our shared humanity, but also the differences in what is shared. Hearing others tell stories about, it can be light or deeper things. Stories of the games you played as a child, the stories of your name, the story of your gift, the story of a person that you love. These are all prompts that I've used or heard used when facilitating conversations like this. Hearing others' stories, they challenge our oversimplified views of each other, ones that people in power want us to hold about each other. They challenge those. They challenge our flattened assumptions of each other. They challenge our stereotypes and our overgeneralizations. So stories are critical. But to actually absorb each other's stories, we have to be able to truly listen. And what the research shows is that we are just not that great at listening as a society. We prize oration, we prize how we speak. We're often thinking about what we're going to say when we are listening to somebody else instead of actually taking in and soaking in their words. So these facilitators told us that we need to start a revolution of listening, that we need to practice being as good at listening as we are at sharing. And then we need to model that deep listening in conversations with hopes that our conversational partners will want to listen to us because they are experiencing how great it feels. You know how it feels when you're truly being listened to. It's different. The third and final point, and it's short, is that remember that you're always modeling communication. I always try to remember that I'm modeling the type of communication that I want in this world. So prioritize listening, prioritize being curious, prioritize staying grounded and breathing and staying present, because you model that communication for your conversational partner, and we take cues from each other, nonverbal cues, as I learned in Dr. Manusov's class. So we can't control how people show up. I knock on doors of people who believe politically differently than I do. And what I tell volunteers who are doing this work is you can't control how they answer the door, but you can control your energy and how you present yourself and how you communicate with that individual. And often you will see if you're being welcoming and intentional about creating a container for dialogue, that has curiosity and has deep listening, you'll watch that rub off on the other person and it'll change the possibilities of that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Can we give them, I wish we had applause in Zoom, but can we at least give them some little spirit fingers or magic hands or some waving to say you're here and you're so grateful for their presentation? We're so glad to share your work. Phil Glenn is going to take it from here. I'm going to feature him here, adding a spotlight. So now there's three of you. in a great little circle of fireside chat. The Positive Communication Network is still working on the actual fire, but it is coming one day, I promise. Phil, the floor is yours. Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you. And everybody, warm yourselves by the metaphorical fire that we have going here. Thank you, Dr. Valerie and Dr. Devon. This is so rich, and I got a chance to read your book and really treasured what you offered us. I've got questions, audience members, and I'll share a few minutes with them of these, and then we invite you to post your questions in chat, and we'll have a few minutes for those as well. So many places to start, but here's one. I'll ask it, and then you all decide which of you wants to speak first or second to it. So dialogues, when as rich as they can be, are not ends in themselves, right? And understanding is not the only goal of a dialogue. So in your book, you talk about different reasons why people in a community might come together in dialogue. But could you talk a bit about how dialogic processes might contribute to different ultimate outcomes? And tied to that, how do co-facilitators evaluate success?
Great questions. Devon, do you want to sort of give a start on this one? Because even though our data were not necessarily about outcomes, in the way that contact theory tends to be focused on reduction of prejudice, we did learn a lot from our facilitators and circle keepers about what they hoped for. And there were differences across the groups.
Yeah, I'll say a little piece and then I'll pass it back to you, Valerie. With the organization I work with right now, our motto is education to action. And we hold this belief that when you become more aware of the realities of the world, that is a major part of what spurs you to get involved and it catalyzes you to get engaged in action. And so I think a lot of the facilitators, all of the facilitators really that we spoke to, had this belief that when people knew better, they would do better. They would want to be more engaged in enacting change, change that their peers were asking for. What would you say, Valerie?
Yeah, in the final chapter in the book, we go over some of the things that we learned from them, and the organizations were really different in their goals. We looked at their organizational materials, their mission statement, and what they were trying to accomplish. And some of them were more action oriented. So this was the start of, not the end of the process. But not all of them were calling for that. And it also depended a great deal on why a particular group was having their session. Sometimes it was kind of mandated. Sometimes it was because a problem arose in the particular community, and other times it was just an opportunity. And each one had somewhat different goals, but all of them were at the basis of it, what Devon was talking about our shared humanity at minimum, to get us to be more empathic, listen to each other more, feel less afraid of one another, feel less different from one another, but also understanding that we don't have the same experience as somebody else. And so we can't sit in a place of judgment necessarily, but often there we're hoping to build friendships, build coalitions, build connections, and especially those that really focused on the critical consciousness that Devon talked about. They really were hoping that that would inform community decisions. So a lot of times they were speaking to people who were city council members or people who were in decision-making positions in order to enact actual sort of structural change. So there were a lot of different kinds of reasons. Most of them, though, just they said that it's whatever is supposed to happen is going to happen. There was a very dynamic quality. So rather than the facilitators thinking we need to get to this end, it was the process. We believe in the process so much that it will get to the end that it needs to get to, in terms of what people are going to take from this and go back into their communities. And in some cases, there were their relationships. So in terms of listening, one of the, an older white guy who was in the group and pretty grumpy the whole time, said that his wife at some point said, something's happened to you, you're different, you're listening to me better. And so it even had an impact on their relationship, even by someone who was sort of fighting the process the whole time.
Very interesting. Thank you. So the book and your talk achieve a great focus by the attention to interracial dialogues. So this question is maybe outside the scope of the book, but I'm just interested in your thinking about it. To what extent are the findings and the practices applicable to other kinds of, what we could call difficult or challenging conversations? What's distinctive about interracial dialogues compared to other kind of dialogues? There's been so much talk lately about red-blue divides, for example. So yeah, just your thoughts about interracial dialogues in particular as different from or similar to other kinds of identity-based groups coming together.
I'll kind of start on this one, Devon, and then have you follow up on it. Part of our focus in particular on the interracial dialogues had to do with the what happened in 2020 with the George Floyd murder and the riots and the racial reckoning that our country appeared to be having at that time. And so these conversations really arose from the exigency of the moment. It's interesting to look back on the book, which was finished before the current administration was voted in, and the things that are happening. So it was kind of written, I think it may be in a more optimistic moment, but I still think we can bring that optimism in. But certainly I think what is happening in the current moment is that race is almost being sort of, the thing that's sort of floating more to the surface is the divide between red and blue, between right and left. And so I started thinking about, can this book be adapted? And I think although the critical consciousness piece will be somewhat different, there's still much that can be learned around the differences that we have politically. But specifically, I would say the same thing. Instead of multiple facilitators who are of different races, multiple facilitators who are from different political parties or having different political positions. So I feel like a lot of the things, and then much of the rest of it can absolutely be used for larger dialogues. I've been spending less time, but think that there's a lot also that we can do for family conversations. The challenging thing is the facilitator component is so important. So I don't, but I still think that individuals can think about this ahead of time and try to incorporate some of these things, practice some of these things before they have perhaps a dialogue with their friends and family. The challenge I think around this is really hard for some of us, and I know it would be for me, not to tell somebody else that they're wrong, even if we deeply believe that they are. But to really go in with greater curiosity. And the times I have had conversations with people, I've learned about why their positions are what they are. And they were, in these cases, coming from a deeper place of emotion and empathy than I would have expected had I not listened to them. So I do think that these can be modified and used in many important ways for other kinds of conversation across difference.
And I would just completely echo that. I think that this book, there are so many different elements of this book that you can utilize when you're having conversations across difference and ideology. Listening deeply, being curious, sharing stories, scaffolding, how not just coming in and asking a tough question right off the bat, but building a relationship with somebody and gaining that trust and then having political conversations. I think all of those things, making sure that, with that scaffolding and you're not trying to debate, you're showing your curiosity so that someone else might show their curiosity. There's just so many things that we can do to kind of have people relax into the conversation and engage with authenticity and honesty and vulnerability in a way that can actually change minds. But that requires going into the conversation, recognizing that you will change your mind too. It's not just especially with political dialogues, we have this mentality of, I'm going to change, this person is 100% wrong and I'm going to change everything that they think because I'm 100% right. And I think we have to come into the conversation demonstrating an openness and a receptivity to hear their points of view and their perspectives, and truly, truly showing saying I think instead of this is true, and like just demonstrating and modeling a type of openness of heart and mind.
I just want to kind of follow up a little bit, and that those points that Dr. Geary made are really important. I even think that some of the, part of what we're seeing in these dialogues is that they're different from our everyday communication. So the kind of listening that's expected is different from everyday listening. And things like equalizing conversations and having community agreements are, although they might feel sort of weird and awkward in a sort of a more informal social group, those things as part of sort of creating the container are really important. And especially when we're talking about something that we feel emotional about, really making sure that people don't interrupt each other, have an equal opportunity for sharing. Those are weird breaks from our normal ways of communicating, but within this context, those become particularly important because it's easy for us to talk over and to yell and to dominate the conversation, which is just going to reinforce our beliefs about each other rather than shift them.
Thank you. Let's see, I have more questions. I will ask one more and then we'll see what our other members of the audience would like to ask you. I'm just curious, how's conducting the research for this book and writing this book changed you as persons in the world or affected you?
We'll go with you, Devon.
Okay, I'll start. Oh man, big time. I
Mm.
When I first started facilitating conversations about race, the mentality at the time was that when people made mistakes, you shut them down, and you shut them down hard. Like, we utilized, I think, shame. It was a really kind of a hard environment. And to talk with these folks, and to hear about how gentle they are and the welcoming and warm space that they create, and how they allow imperfections, and how they really center love and connection, has changed and really like been a huge relief. And because it's such a more beautiful way of learning together, and making change. And so, yeah, I think my way of engaging in conversations with people who disagree with me has greatly changed. My gentleness and grace on myself when I inevitably make mistakes when talking about race as a white woman, that has changed. So, yeah, I see these facilitators are mentors, and have continued to shape and help me kind of evolve in my thinking about how we can go about creating the community and ultimately the beloved community.
My feeling too is I'm an idealist. I'm a, rose-colored glasses kind of person, definitely a positive communication disciple. And what helped me with this is to realize that we can't just will all of this to happen. We can't will our world to be different. We can't will each other to be different. It is a messy process. It is a challenging process. It's a risk-taking process. But with the right sort of support, we can maybe do it better. And it's easy for us to want to kind of run away from these conversations. And this gives me more confidence going into them and hope for what they can achieve than I had, I think, before. I think I had sort of a blind hope before, and now I think I have a more realistic hope about what makes these things possible and how life-changing they can be. So that gives me an overall hope in a time when sometimes hope feels a little bit less available. I go to Tom on this one with hope communication.
So doing this work has really deepened your conviction that this can work or can help. Yeah. Oh, awesome. Well, we have just a few minutes left. Let's check in the Q&A. We've got one question, and let me invite folks joining us here to post any other questions you'd like to. Brandon is asking, what was the hardest part of writing the book and performing the study? And was there anything that shifted your perspectives while writing the book?
I do want to honor Devon on this. I was her advisor for her dissertation project. I ended up becoming the primary person to pull the book together because Devon was busy with trying to get people out to vote and so many and getting married and so many other wonderful things. So and I was more involved in this and the data than normal. But Devon is the one who is doing all of the focus groups and interviews and contacting the organizations. And so I think she's the best person to speak to about this.
Thank you, Valerie. That's very kind. I'd say I'll say the biggest challenge for me, but I am very curious about the biggest challenge for you as well. The biggest challenge for me, I think, was honestly writing this book as a white woman. When I was facilitating the conversations, I was very aware of my racial identity, and I wanted to be sure to be very, very intentional about how we wrote this book, and mindful of the positionalities that we had in that process and what that, and Valerie and I had many conversations about that, and what that looked like ultimately was that we are creating a platform in which we are uplifting the voices of people who have the lived experience, and who are doing this work. And they are white and they are people of color. But we are focusing on their voices and on their experiences. And so it's less about what we think about how to facilitate these conversations. And it's more about, here is this culmination of what these people who are actually doing the work, what they think, and what's been their experiences and what have been their hurdles. And that way, becomes a resource for other people trying to do this very, very brave work, and for everyday people like us who are engaging in these conversations, hopefully every day, because it's so important, no matter your identity, that you're having conversations about race, that you're having conversations about ideology, especially right now in this socio-political moment. So that, I would say, that was the biggest hurdle for me, was being very, very intentional every step of the way of reflecting on my race and how that would influence a book about facilitating interracial conversations about race.
And I would echo a lot of what Devon just said. The fact that we were primarily trying to give voice and structure to the myriad voices that we listened to was a really important part of it. So half of the book is quotes. We try to provide some framing for that, but it was really important that we make sure that the participants, that the facilitators and the circle keepers all had a chance to review what we were saying, push back if there was anything that wasn't quite right. For example, not all of the organizations work with critical consciousness as one of their aspects of the container, because we didn't want to impose. We knew as researchers that we could maybe see the bigger picture and add something to what the work that they're doing, but we really, really privileged their work and their words. And in doing that, for me, I just, I read the book now, besides working on the book, probably 4 times, and I still laugh and cry along with some of the things that the facilitators and circle keepers talked about. And I'm just so impressed with their degree of dedication and their willingness to do the work themselves. A lot of them talk about continuing their own work on anti-racism and breaking down boundaries. So, and this work isn't easy. So the focus on grounding is really, really important. Not just for the participants, but even more so for the facilitators, because this is exhausting, it's inspiring, but it's difficult work.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions in chat. Thank you, Brandon, for the question. Appreciate that very much. I have another question, but I wonder, let's see. I see Michelle. Hi, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I put a question in chat. I'll just read it. I did, yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I looked at in the preview of the book online, I looked at the list of organizations that were involved in your research. So I was wondering, and you can get a sense of a little bit of their mission just from the titles. Were the participants in these conversations already somewhat self-selected as folks who were interested in and committed to the conversations, bridging understanding, etc.? Were any of the conversational groups made up of individuals who came in less open or resistant to the goals of the conversations?
Thank you.
I will start, and I will say that many of the organizations that we talked to, I won't say a majority, many talked about an intentional decision to work with groups who had opted into having these conversations, who had signed up to, because they had worked with groups in the past with folks who had been mandated to be a part of the conversation, and that not always went well. And sometimes you would have an individual who was very disruptive, or a group that just wasn't engaging. And when it hindered the process that much, some organizations decided, you know what, it's more important that we're working with people who at least are ready to commit to engaging in the process that we have here. Some groups, however, worked with everyone and anyone. Folks who were mandated, folks who maybe didn't quite know what they were getting into before stepping into the circle. And those groups talked about I'm thinking specifically of a group in Seattle called Waihuru, and they'd use a circle technique, and they talk about the power of the circle. And so circle keepers were like facilitators. We kind of use that word interchangeably, but the process was very, very similar. But there were a few differences that you'll see throughout the book. But these circle keepers really emphasized that they trusted the process, And that might mean that when they got to some people, they were really pushing back against the process and saying, you know, I'm not about this, like this isn't working. But they'd watch. And by the last time that they got together, or maybe even a couple times in, especially getting really listened to, when participants realized that they were actually going to be heard and were actually going to have the space to be able to share, and that people weren't going to interrupt them, and that people were really going to listen to them, people bought into the process more. And so they would see these evolutions of people who struggled with the process at first, but then became more of a believer in what the power of this equalizing circle and this container could do. But yes, most of the organizations, I think, really worked with people who had signed up and were willing. But some where, you know, people would walk in the door and they would hold this process, or, you know, even really invited people who were questioning the process to be a part of it. What would you say, Valerie?
Yeah, the conversational condition of adapting to participant readiness sort of speaks to this. And there were, in the descriptions of people, they often talked about people who really didn't want to be there or didn't have the skills to be there, and how they worked with that. Because even though, for example, if they were working with a particular community and the community didn't they might have said they didn't mandate it necessarily, but there were people there who didn't want to be there. So on an individual level, and in general, the facilitators tried to work with each one. There were times in which they had to ask people to leave. So, but it wasn't typically, these were not people who just wanted to get along better. These were people where there was some sort of issue. So there was an aspect of pre-selection, but oftentimes actually the group that they were part of selected to be part of it, but the individuals within it weren't necessarily so. But they often, the organizations often would ask for feedback at the end, and a lot of them would say, like, I hated it, I hated it, I hated it, and now I love it. So even people who really didn't want to be there and didn't like it, with some exceptions. And some of those exceptions were people who felt like they had already done all of their work, especially certain people of colors that I've been dealing with this my whole life. I don't need to learn anymore. And sometimes those were the folks that left. More often they were people who these conversations were so new to them and too overwhelming, or they felt like they didn't need to hear it, which is unfortunate because being part of it would have been useful, but most of them stayed.
Very rich. Well, we are nearing the end of our hour. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Tom to take us on to the next part, the last 5 minutes, and I will remove myself from spotlight.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank
Don't
you.
remove yourself from the spotlight, Phil. You were always at the center. You can hang out. Thank you, Phil. Wonderful. I really appreciate the the questions that you ask and our wonderful guests. Again, be sure to, we'll do this in just a second, share your excitement and your, happiness and your thumbs up for them for being here. There are so many questions that come to mind that we have an after party. Sometimes folks feel a little more comfortable in just hanging out and asking your questions. So Brian Fuller, our esteemed colleague from California, is going to be leading that shortly. So we hang around about 15 minutes or so longer because some folks just want to keep the party going, and we like to do that. I've got many questions as well. I've done some of this work myself in family systems, and I can remember back when I was a master's student, when dinosaurs were still running around Chicago. I studied with a guy, Tom Kochman, and I took a course on the ethnography of Black communication where I was the only white student in the class. That was, for me, super transformative. I started, because you become super aware when you're the only one, right? Did you encounter that kind of situation when you were there, or pretty interracial groups, or how'd that work for these sorts of things? I'm curious.
They were all either interracial groups or, yeah, they were all interracial groups. And so there was always facilitators of color, white facilitators. And so I was never the only white person there. So it was, and I think that was a powerful piece of it, because we got to, facilitators often said that they did the work to do the work. And so they were engaging in their own dynamics and challenges interpersonally with their co-facilitators, their interracial co-facilitators. And the same thing happened when we would get together. And so we were being very mindful about making sure everybody had an equal amount of time to speak. Like when you got on a call with those facilitators, you wanted to use your best communication skills because they were. And so we were, again, as an interracial group, doing the work so that we could do the work.
Yeah, it can be difficult. I remember the first time I presented at the National Council of Black Social Workers, and I think there were 3 white people and like 80 African-American folks, and then a white guy standing up to talk about parenting in the African-American community as well as white community. So sometimes you have to use a little bit of humor. I'd always remind folks, I'm a white guy. And they go, oh yeah, he's white. And at least I become conscious of it, as I think that's a part of the conversation. Well, in our last 60 seconds, what we do is we have a sort of a tradition. What I'd like you to do is use the chat and write a positive word or two to these authors. Everyone who's here, just send your fantastic love messages in the chat. So cascade those love messages, go to chat and start typing it. We got mahalo, work is awesome, aligns with everybody's experience. Miss you, Valerie. Okay, yeah, just keep them coming in our last waning moments, because the Positive Communication Network wants to support all the good work that's being done out there to advance, valuable work for social change. That's kind of what we're about, is sort of to help facilitate use of communication, the power of communication to advance and to deal with and help satisfy the many human needs that are out there in the world. There'll be more things coming up in the future. There's a conference coming up, a national conference on the 21st of March, where we're going to talk about happy communication and happy work. Patrice Busnell is going to come in and share with us some ideas about happy workers and how that works, and being happy at work. I'm currently working on the handbook, a new handbook of positive communication that's underway. As struggling as it is, it's always happy, wherever it is. It'll be eventually done, and so you'll be seeing more in terms of the literature. You'll be seeing things coming out of Julian Miravel's work with Heifer International. And there's more. Ryan edited a special issue recently of the International Journal of Business Communication. Way cool. You'll be hearing some about his very cool work. So in the meantime, join in the Positive Communication Network. That's www.positivecommunication.net. Right? Log in there, take a look at some of the cool stuff. There's some educational things, there's some research things, there's some things we keep adding to it and developing it and doing more work with it. Just the idea of a place where people of like minds and positive outcomes can get together. So what we're going to do is end the formal part. And then Ryan's going to come in, our after party person. Let me spotlight Ryan. There's at Spotlight, there's Ryan. And so we're going to party with Ryan a little bit further. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. We appreciate it. Stay around as long as you want to ask your questions and interact. We will be here for a while longer. Ryan.
Thank you to Valerie and to Devon for your awesome presentation about the important work that you're doing. Thanks to my colleagues Tom and Phil for their work in facilitating, and also colleague Julian. So welcome to the after party, which is an informal discussion with our presenters today, where we get to kind of carry on or carry over the questions that that we didn't get to discuss during the book party component. My hope is to not personally speak very much, and to have our wonderful authors and guests do more of the talking, and I'll just kind of fade to the background. But I did have a question. Could you give a kind of a concrete and specific example where individuals would be mandated to participate in these discussions, and one where, you know, it's more so voluntary?
Devon, you want to speak to that?
I'm trying to, think of examples off the top of my head from interviews, and
The police one is one I think of as a mandatory.
can you share that one, Valerie?
I don't remember the specifics, but there was a conversation that was required for members of a small town police group with some community leaders. That would be because of some issues that arose in the community. So that would be a mandated one.
Yep.
Others are people find out about the organization and choose to be in them, but more of them are more specific to the communities, I believe.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some that were work mandated, like an organization thought or a business thought that it would be a good idea to have their colleagues go through like what they saw as like a diversity training. And in the book, we talk a lot about how this was different than a DEI, or not DEI, but diversity initiatives that are others that are mandated. This is a different kind of work, and how that went when it was mandated for people in businesses. And but the ones where they were voluntary were typically, as Valerie said, communities that maybe had an issue, maybe a racial incident, or there was tension amongst community members, and so they got in touch with this organization and said, hey, can you come in and, lead a circle with us and lead a dialogue with us and help facilitate this conversation, because there's tension, there's conflict, and we want to grapple with it, but we think we need help to do that and do it effectively.
Yeah, several of them talked about the difference between a DEI training and this kind of dialogue. And it wasn't that they were saying that DEI trainings aren't useful, but they are more information oriented. And while there was some information that was in a part of these, especially around critical consciousness, it really was a process of engagement and learning together with this real sense of equity and hearing and participant focused as opposed to facilitator focused. Facilitators often really tried to stay out of things as much. So they felt that the work was deeper and had a potentially more lasting impact. And typically there were multiple ones of these. So it wasn't just one time when they got together. There were multiple multiple times that they got together, which allowed them to sort of deepen that process, and why the importance of continuing to repeat the community agreements was, so some of them would start every time with the community agreements, and so often they would have people in the group read them so that people really bought into them. Yeah.
I had a quick question, like in these moments, you have moments of tension and clearly struggle, but how about some moments of deep joy? Were there moments that you went, yeah, I'm digging this?
Yeah, we had one facilitator who really swore a lot, and he was awesome. And he would just talk about that it would be, we would be doing this, we'd be doing that, and it was just effing brilliant. You know, that the things that he saw people open up and laugh and cry that he didn't expect. Like people who would be sitting there, you know, for several of the sessions like that, and that something would get through to them. And there was a lot of humor. But just really and the emotional release was a really big part of it, where people broke down, and then also people were there to be in, hold them in a way, but not physically, and they weren't allowed to go up to them and say everything was going to be okay. They let people really feel what they needed to feel, and people often came out of that just kind of refreshed and ready to do the work in a way that they weren't before, when they were holding on to all of those things. So yeah, lots of good humor, lots of good breakthrough moments. And that helped the facilitators keep wanting to do the work.
All right. How about for you, Devon? Moments of great joy in doing this?
Oh, like ourselves personally in doing this work?
Yeah.
Oh, man. I mean, I felt honored, and like it was an immense gift to be able to have conversations with these people, because they are people doing work that I revere, that I really deeply, deeply admire. This is, as we talked about, this is not easy work. You're talking about, when you're talking about race, you're talking about centuries of grave, grave injustice. So there's deep heartache and deep, there's trauma there. But then, these facilitators are able to hold this conversation and are able to, in the midst of that, connect people and show them their shared humanity, and also have them change how they see themselves and each other and our world. And that's just the transformational possibilities with these dialogues. Yeah, I just, there was so much joy for me in being able to learn from them, and to think about how I could adapt that into my life, and how I could kind of spread that out into my networks, and get this information out so that more of us can communicate in these really intentional and wonderful ways. So yeah, lots of joy.
And it was a joy for me to work with Devon. This was a heart project of hers, but my heart totally opened to it as soon as we started working with it, and working with the data was amazing. But it warms my heart to hear about the facilitators doing this work, but also to know that there are young people like Devon who are so deeply committed to it. That's pretty awesome.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Valerie.
Wonderful. Well, you're tugging at the heartstrings. This is just wonderful. I think it is transformative. We got Michelle. Jump in.
Hi, yes. So I appreciated so much you talking about your positionality and your race and the work. I'm a sociologist, and I've studied and done focus groups on race and masculinity as a white woman, so I can identify with that. I appreciate, of course, that you address that and in the book, of course. And in fact, I'll be honest, when we first started, I thought,
Yeah.
I wonder if they thought about inviting a third author, a person of color, to sort of lend to that. But yeah. And this may be a disciplinary difference too. So then I thought, as we're continuing to talk more, and then I learned, okay, yes, it's grounded research and so forth, qualitative data that you collected. And number one, you may not have control of this. I've never published a book. I've published, articles and all, but I was thinking, oh, well, and this may also be a disciplinary difference between sociology and communication. Although I do media studies, and I was an undergrad communication, like human communication major. But anyway, I'm digressing. I was thinking, though, a subtitle could maybe for your second edition or your next book, where it would say insights from community organizations. So it says right from the beginning, as people are looking at your book, oh, this is grounded research from folks in the field, not just like we're the authority. Of course you're experts and you're bringing that structure and all, as you mentioned, Dr. Manusov, but that could be something. So hopefully if you get a second edition, that may just be, really, again, that may be a disciplinary difference where I think a lot of sociologists, we put it out there that we're saying like this research is coming from, so, or, in the tradition of ethnographies and so forth. So I don't know if, do you have, how much control do you have over the title from these publishers? I don't even know. So
you have to say that was a publisher decision. It was not our decision. They said there was not enough room on the cover of the book to have our subtitle, which didn't really emphasize that this was about the facilitators and not about our judgments, like these are the things that you should do to facilitate, because we're the learners in this process as well. In terms of sort of our own whiteness, in addition to continuing to think through, write about it as well. And because the project was something that we did together, having a third author wouldn't have made sense because sort of the work was done already, but we did invite Dr. Tina Harris to write the preface for us. She read the book. She and I were already in conversation about a lot of other things. We used her book in particular because she talks about how to dismantle racism one conversation at a time in our interpersonal relationships. And so getting the opportunity to get insight from her and to have her featured in the book helped us somewhat with that.
That's great.
Yeah, someone who I have tremendous respect for, and she felt that she was great. So definitely read her preface.
Yes, for sure. And that's frustrating about the publishers. Oh, they don't get like that's important. But thank you for thanks for letting me share.
We love our editor, Todd Armstrong, but that was one they did. We appreciated that they let us go with the image that we wanted, but the purple and having Dr. Harris's name on it, which is not typical in these books either. So I think the choice was having her name or the subtitle. So we went. I think we went with her name.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you.
Good question and comment. Thank you.
I have one one other question, which is kind of in this environment that we're in, right? Where when you talk about DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is now an acronym or phrase that is that carries a strong negative connotation from kind of the political leadership of the country, and I can see how it might the work that you're doing, which is very important, can be lumped into that category. So I'm thinking about like how, given kind of the national context that we're in, how can we talk about this work and engage in this work when it seems like there are very difficult and challenging and potentially ramifications for doing it.
I'm going to start with that one, although Devon, I think, has a lot more to say about it. And she and I have said, this could, if anyone actually pays attention to the book, it might get on the banned book list or might get us on a watch list of some kind. And we're like, bring it on. We, in the introduction, we try to, especially thanks to Devon, really talk about this in a very direct way. And we don't pull punches. And so we are definitely about, we would have changed things a little bit and made it even more direct, given what's happened. So between the time that we finished the book and now, but no, for us, it's really important to actually get this out there and to get it out there in a strong way, that we look at this as an act of resistance.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that that there's pushback against having these types of dialogues is a symptom of the fact that we need to have more of them, in fact, and that it is a source, it is resistance. Engaging in dialogue in this political context is resistance. And it's something that we all need to do, and we all need to do more of, because we need to spread awareness about our history, around current realities, and we need to connect with each other more. We need to bridge across our differences, and also bond. They call it bonding when it's cross with people who are, you know, your family and your immediate friends. We need to do all of the more of that to build community and build awareness and have these conversations with everybody. So I think the fact that it's under attack is more of a reason to do it more. And I say that from a privileged position, because I'm not an entity. I'm not working for an entity that is under attack currently by this administration. But yeah, I plan to do this. I plan to have these conversations and continue having these conversations, pretty much regardless of what happens. So,
And you are a
yeah.
woman, so being a woman and a Democrat,
That's true.
you are under attack as well, not in the same way, not historically the same way, but nonetheless.
Yeah, very true.
Looks like Brandon has asked a question, and I think we can take this last question before ending the after party. So Brandon asked, as we navigate the next few months, what would you say is the benefit of having these sometimes tough conversations?
You know, there's so many people who are saying, what can I do? I don't know what to do. And we might not be able to make policy change, but we can. And I go back to Dr. Harris's book about dismantling racism one relationship at a time, one conversation at a time. I think some people are opening their eyes to things that have been there all the time. As people are attempting to say, no, none of this is there. I was just reading something about how that everything that liberals do is based on the false premise that there's systemic and structural racism, but that's not true. And but other people are realizing, actually, I'm seeing it now in a way I didn't before, other white people. And there's an opportunity to, I think, in this moment, to tap into people's vulnerability in the positive sense. But mostly that we're looking for, so many of us are looking for something to do that can help either other individuals or our neighborhood or ourselves. And these conversations can, I think, be part of that. They may seem small, but they're big.
Yep, absolutely. I think if you have somebody in your life who sees differently than you politically, because that overlaps in so many ways with race, especially in the current context that we're in. Having conversations with that person, engaging them in dialogue, and not going at it in a way that's going to shut them down and shut them out, but actually like reaching across and having these, as Brandon, you're writing tough conversations. It's an act of those are the things that can change how people vote, and that leads to then who's put into office and who has power, and then, you know, and on and on and on. And so in a time when books are being banned and truth is being suppressed, we are in an emergency situation. And so we need to help open people's eyes to what is truth and what is reality. And we can utilize these tough conversations in order to do that. And we need to.
To try to really focus on our shared humanity in the midst of attempts at the inhumanity that is occurring.
Yep.
I thank our authors, presenters for their presentation once again, as well as for staying with us for the after chat. I thank everybody who joined the after chat, and I encourage you all to get the book, and carry on follow-up conversations with the authors. They work for organizations where their contact information is available.
We're sorry we can't I've given away all of the books that have been given already, so I'm glad that at least there's a discount. I'm sorry that we just can't give, we don't have to give.
No, understandable. I hope that everybody has a great rest of their day. Thank you for joining, and hope that you all can join our next event.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
For
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.